The prologue to A Game of Thrones is actually really interesting. In this video, I'm going to break down my version of the events that take place. You can find the Game of Thrones books over on Amazon. I've linked them down below in the description. If you enjoy this content, please slap a like on it. The like goal is going to be 69. Now, this series actually starts out with 3 different Night's Watch members. The main one being Sir Waymar Royce, son of Bronzion Royce, who is a lord in the Vale, which is one of the 7 kingdoms in Westeros. So we find out that they've actually been given a mission to track a group of wildling raiders into the haunted forest. Eventually, on the 9th day of searching, they come across the bodies of the slain wildlings. Gared, who is the more experienced of the group, basically, we find out later on in Game of Thrones through Tyrion's POV that Gared has actually spent more time at the Wall than Lord Commander GR Mormont himself. So basically, GR is talking with Tyrion, and he tells him that it's crazy that Gared deserted the Night's Watch because that's something that Gared would never do. Like, in all the time that he knew him, remember, Gared was at the Wall before Jeor Mormont, who's the father of Jorah Mormont, kept in friend zone. Before Jeor even gets there, Gared is there. He's the most experienced ranger in the Night's Watch at this time. But anyway, Gared immediately decides that something feels wrong about this place and mentions that they should probably head back to Castle Black. But Waymar Royce, the younger and inexperienced, is a lordling, right? So he's got that typical Westerosi attitude of, I'm better than you. So Waymar Royce ends up mocking the experienced Gared and tells him to wait a distance away with the horses, and he and Will go up close and see the bodies at the camp. While searching, Waymar and Will are unable to find any of the bodies of the wildling raiders. Will then decides he wants to get higher ground by climbing a tree to have a look around to see if he can spot the bodies from up there. Then, out of nowhere seemingly, the air becomes extremely cold, and Waymar, who's on the ground, is then surrounded by others. Waymar then, of course, fights the others bravely. Like, even though he's a lordling in Westeros, and he's a douchebag to Gared and Will, the more experienced members of his party of Night's Watchmen, he puts up a really good fight against the others, but he ultimately gets blinded because his long sword, shatters when it makes contact with the other's blade. Afterwards, he is quickly killed by the others, having no weapon, and they leave his body on the ground, and the others kind of disappear. At least Will stays tree-bound until he's sure, the others are gone, until he can no longer see them. Afterwards, he then proceeds to climb down and is attacked and strangled to death by an undead Waymar. Obviously, Gared watches all of this and is mortified. He's the, most experienced Night's Watchman, or the Ranger, most experienced in their party, spent more time at the Wall than Jeor Mormont himself, and he's watching this from a distance. He's mortified. He obviously ends up fleeing south of the Wall. He doesn't even stop at Castle Black. That's really kind of sets the tone for this story, especially, like I said, since we find out later in Tyrion's POV that Gared would never do something like that. He spent more time at the Wall than the Lord Commander himself. So after he witnesses Waymar and Will killed by the others, he decides he no longer wants to take part as a Night's Watchman, even though it means death. He's kind of like in a state of shock. Then eventually we find out what happens to him through Bran's POV, and I'll just kind of wrap it up real quick, and I'll cover all the events that happen in Bran's, the very first chapter of A Game of Thrones, because remember, this is a prologue, but I'll cover that in the next video if you all like these series of videos. If you want, you could actually leave me a comment down below and let me know, and if it gets upvoted the most, I'll kind of skip around in the books because I've recently finished multiple read-throughs, and, I kind of just want to get my version of this story out there. But anyway, eventually, Gared is captured in the hills outside Winterfell in a nearby holdfast. Then we find out that Ned and all of his children, through the POV of Bran, have arrived to question him. Ned's questioning doesn't really reach the dude because Gared is in such a state of shock. He's like, Ned does ask him a few questions, but nothing really reaches him. So obviously Ned sentences to death and then chops his head off. And one interesting thing, aside from the fact that Ned is telling Bran afterwards, like, do you know why I did that? And Bran's like, oh, because he's a deserter. And Ned's like, no, that's not the question. Do you know why I did that? And he's like, we're from the north. We have the blood of the first men in our bodies, and we do things differently. Even though the king has a justice, and I'm doing this in the name of Robert, the first of his name of House Baratheon, we still do this ourselves because I said the sentence, so I must swing the sword. But before that, when Jared is first beheaded, his head hits a tree stump as it rolls down, and the tree stump causes it to land near Theon's feet. Theon, it's mentioned from Bran's POV that Theon thinks everything is funny. Theon laughs when the head rolls near him, then he puts his boot on it and kicks it away. Obviously, Jon does not like this, who's talking to Bran at the time, and mutters a curse word underneath his breath about how shitty of a person Theon is. Well, alright, hopefully you now, if you didn't beforehand, have a better understanding of what happens in the very first chapter in A Game of Thrones. I guess it's the prologue. The very first chapter is Bran. I kind of explained what happened there. But I'll go in more depth in the next video. Thank you for watching. My name's Mark, and consider checking out my Patreon over on patreon.com/SirHunsReviews. I plan on doing live streams only on my Patreon where I talk about really everything from the books. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.